The wind blew steady and cool over the dunes of the Outer Banks as Emily Walton stepped from her rental car and watched the Atlantic churn under a pale dawn. She had not been here in 5 years. 5 years of avoiding every mention of Corolla Beach. 5 years of silencing that voice that asked how her sister could just vanish. The storm back then had been brutal enough to close highways and shatter windows. When the news came that Carrie and Ethan had disappeared from their beachfront rental, everyone blamed the sea. She felt the ache in her chest as she remembered her mother crying over the phone. Emily had left North Carolina behind, chasing nursing shifts in Charlotte, avoiding the coast like it was cursed. But now she stood again among the dunes, hands shoved in her coat pockets, feeling that the land itself had been waiting for her return. A hurricane had swept through a month earlier, tearing away the fragile dunes and leaving behind strange debris. That was why she was here now, summoned by a call from the local sheriff's department. A beachcomber had found something half buried among the roots of a toppled sea oak. She had tried to keep her voice steady when they described it over the line. A dented metal cooler coated in sand and salt, the lid warped but still shut tight. Inside, they had found Ethan's phone and a silver locket with Carrie's initials engraved in old-fashioned cursive. Emily had not answered at first, listening to the wind over the line, her mind racing with impossible questions. She had promised her mother she would identify it in person. That promise had forced her onto the road at dawn, the long drive east from Charlotte heavy with dread. Now she stood at the edge of the crime scene tape, watching the officers pack up their gear and comb through other wind-flattened patches of grass. Detective Sam Morales approached, nodding and greeting, his lined face shaded by a battered cap. He had been the one to call her his voice patient, but determined. She recognized in his gait the careful way someone moved who had seen too many families break under news like this. He handed her a sealed evidence bag with the locket. Emily took it with gloved fingers, brushing the sand away to see the familiar swirl of letters. She had given that to Carrie on her 25th birthday, an antique store find she had spent too much on at the time. The sight of it made her throat close painfully, the memories crowding like gulls on the pier. She swallowed hard and nodded, returning it. Morales watched her carefully, but did not rush her. He told her they had managed to power up Ethan's phone after drying it with silica packs in the evidence room. Most of it was corroded junk apps frozen, but one video file had been surprisingly intact. The words hung between them as she braced herself. Morales had described it on the phone, but hearing it again made it worse. Carrie sat against what looked like the beach house porch railing, hair plastered to her face, whispering to the camera in a shaking voice. She said they could not trust Brian anymore. Emily felt the shudder ripple through her entire body. That name had once been so familiar, a family friend, practically another brother. The way Carrie said it on that video made it foreign and frightening. Emily followed Morales to his SUV, where he replayed the video on a tablet. She watched every flicker of the screen, listening to the wind distort Carrie's voice. Her sister's face looked younger, somehow, despite the terror. She remembered brushing that hair from her face when they were kids, remembered Carrie's infectious laugh that used to fill every room. When the video ended, there was only the sound of the ocean crashing beyond the dunes. Morales let the silence sit before explaining the next steps. He said they would keep the cooler and phone in evidence while they reopened the case. It had been marked inactive within 48 hours after the storm. Everyone had been so certain the ocean had claimed them, the riptides around Corolla famous for their merciless pull. But now there was something more to chase. Emily's eyes scanned the beach, imagining the house where it had all happened. It sat half a mile south, rented out to vacationers who had no idea what had once occurred there. She thought about that last night, the storm closing in, the wind so strong the power went out along the coast. Carrie and Ethan had planned a quiet dinner celebrating their engagement with homemade seafood stew and champagne. The storm warning had kept their friends away. Brian had been the only one with the nerve to drive out in that weather. Emily's stomach clenched at the thought. He had always been Ethan's best friend, his business partner since high school, practically family. She remembered how he had stood with them at her parents' kitchen counter after the news, broke, eyes red, voice cracking. How had they missed the crack in his story? She felt her shoes sink in the damp sand as she turned back toward the dunes. Morales asked if she would be willing to visit the station, give an official statement about the locket, maybe help identify other items. She nodded numbly, already exhausted from the emotion pressing on her ribs. As they walked, she heard the distant call of gulls and the hiss of wind in the grasses. The beach felt deserted, a graveyard of memories. She realized she had avoided this place for so long because she had known deep down that it would never let her leave without answers. Now, the past was rising from the sand, demanding to be heard. The drive to the station was quiet except for the steady beat of the windshield wipers as drizzle started to fall. Emily watched the familiar shops slide by, places she and Carrie had loved. She saw the old bait and tackle store where they had picked out cheap sunglasses one summer, giggling like idiots. The memories hurt like burns, fresh and unhealed. At the station, Morales handed her a cup of coffee that steamed in the damp air. He asked her if she was ready to tell him everything she remembered about Carrie and Ethan's last visit, about Brian, about that weekend. Emily took a long breath, feeling the tears sting but refusing to let them fall. She was here now. She was going to see this through. She was going to find out what really happened on the night the ocean swallowed her sister. Emily parked her car in the narrow gravel lot beside the Corolla Beach rental house, the wind whipping her hair into her face as she stepped out and surveyed the building. The old place looked much the same as it had 5 years ago. White clapboard siding, weathered to a soft gray broad front porch, sagging slightly at the edges. She remembered helping Carrie and Ethan choose it for that engagement weekend, their excitement filling her phone calls for weeks. It had been the perfect spot, close to the dunes and the wild Atlantic, far enough from town for privacy. Now the front windows reflected only the dull, overcast sky, empty and cold. She stood there, gripping her keys until her knuckles went white, feeling the weight of every promise she had made to her sister pressing into her shoulders like wet sand. Inside the house, the air was stale and cool, the faint smell of salt water and old wood thick in her nose. Dust covered the surfaces despite claims the property had been cleaned regularly. Emily let her fingers trail across the chipped paint of the banister as she moved into the living room where the furniture sat in the exact arrangement Carrie had picked out. The striped sofa and wicker chairs looked abandoned mid-conversation, their cushions sagging, coffee table empty except for a single old magazine curling at the edges. She sat heavily on the edge of the couch, elbows on her knees, staring at the walls as if they might answer her. She could almost hear the echo of Carrie's laugh, Ethan's voice, teasing her about her obsession with candles. Emily's chest ached with the ghost of their happiness. Detective Morales had suggested she stay in town a few days. He thought she might remember details worth sharing. She knew he was right, but it felt like a sentence rather than advice. The memories flooded her with every creak of the floorboards. She wandered into the kitchen, noting the cracked tiles Ethan had planned to fix the crooked cabinet door Carrie always forgot to close. She ran her hand over the granite countertop where they had once prepared meals together. The refrigerator was empty, but still running, humming in the silence like a distant plea for attention. She wondered if anyone had stood here after that night and tried to imagine what had gone wrong. She wondered if Brian had stood here, maybe cleaning something, maybe rehearsing a lie. The thought made her stomach turn. She'd found the small bedroom off the hall that Carrie had loved for its view of the dunes. The bed was stripped to the mattress plastic cover crinkling under her weight as she sat. She remembered Carrie describing her plans to decorate it in pale blues and sea glass greens, a perfect coastal retreat. The house had stayed frozen in that plan, untouched since they vanished. Emily got up and pushed open the closet door, blinking at the darkness inside. The space was empty except for a single wire hanger and a crumpled grocery bag someone had forgotten. She crouched and picked it up, finding it held only scraps of old receipts and a dried-up pen. Nothing that would tell her what happened. Nothing that would bring them back. As she moved back into the hall, she noticed a small framed photo still hanging on the wall, a shot from that weekend's first evening. Ethan's arm was wrapped around Carrie's waist, both of them smiling, their eyes crinkling at the corners. Brian stood beside them holding up a bottle of wine like a trophy. Emily stared at his face for a long time. She remembered how fond she had been of him growing up. He had been like a big brother, always quick with a joke, the kind of guy her parents trusted. She had cried in his arms after the police first called. Now she felt cold, looking at his image as if something in her gut had known all along that it did not fit anymore. Emily took the photo off the wall and set it carefully on the dining table. She walked to the back porch, pushing open the screen door with a squeal of rusted hinges. The view was breathtaking, even in the gray light. Dunes rolling like gentle hills, grass flattened by wind, the ocean restless beyond. She closed her eyes and listened to the crashing surf. She had not realized how much she missed that sound, how it reminded her of childhood vacations with Carrie, their bare feet sinking into wet sand as they raced the tide. She stood there until the wind made her shiver. Then she turned back inside, closing the door firmly behind her as if to keep the ghosts out. She finally made her way back to the living room and sat again on the couch this time, opening her notebook and clicking a pen with deliberate precision. Morales had asked her to write down everything she remembered about Brian, about that weekend, about the calls and texts she had exchanged with Carrie. She forced herself to start with the last conversation, the one that still woke her up some nights. Carrie had sounded distracted, a little breathless. She said Ethan was being stubborn about something, but it would be okay. She promised Emily they would talk more after dinner. That call had been cut short by static as the wind rattled the windows. Emily had not called back. She had assumed they would pick up the next day where they left off. Now she knew there would never be a next day. Emily rubbed her eyes and let the pen drop onto the notebook. She realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled shakily and forced herself to keep writing. She listed every memory of Brian she could dredge up. She wrote about his loyalty to Ethan, the way he had been best man at his first wedding, the endless nights they spent planning their construction business. She wrote about his easy smile, the way he had always teased Carrie like a sister. But then she wrote about the moments that had felt off in hindsight. The way he had been the one to call the police so quickly, but then insisted on the drowning theory even before they found the wreckage. The way he had paid the lease on the house all these years, telling Emily he wanted to keep it as a memorial. She tried to decide if that was kindness or control. She found she did not know. She remembered how Morales had asked if she knew Brian would be in town this week. He had already arranged to meet her tomorrow, offering to walk her through what he remembered of that night. Emily had felt her throat tighten at the thought. She had not seen him since the memorial service where he had read Ethan's eulogy in a steady voice while she fell apart in the front pew. She wondered what it would be like to look him in the eye now. Would she see the boy she had trusted, or the man she was starting to fear? She closed the notebook carefully and set it on the coffee table beside the photo. Then she stood and let the silence of the house press around her until she could not stand it anymore. She walked back out to her car in the deepening dusk, glancing over her shoulder at the house that seemed to lean toward her with memories. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, watching the sky darken until the ocean disappeared into the horizon. She did not know what she would say to Brian tomorrow. She did not know if she would even be able to speak, but she knew she had to try. She owed that much to Carrie and Ethan. She owed it to herself. Emily awoke in the small guest room of the Corolla Beach Inn before sunrise, the salt air drifting through the cracked window like a memory she could not escape. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the hush of early morning surf before swinging her legs to the floor. She dressed slowly, tying her hair back, pulling on the old canvas jacket she had brought for the chill. The mirror above the dresser showed eyes rimmed red from crying, a mouth drawn tight with unspoken words. She ignored the reflection and grabbed her notebook from the table. Today, she planned to return to the house alone before she met Morales at the station. She needed time to look without someone hovering time to let the place speak to her in its own broken language. She parked in the same spot beside the sagging porch and let herself in with the key the caretaker had given her reluctantly the night before. The door swung open on stiff hinges, and the smell of old wood and salt water rushed to greet her. She stood in the entryway listening to the wind whistle through the cracked storm windows. She tried to imagine Carrie's laughter in that space again, the way her sister would have dropped her bag carelessly by the door, kicked off her shoes with a grin. But the house felt hollow now, like a mouth missing too many teeth. Emily forced herself forward, the floorboards creaking beneath her steps, and started with the living room. She examined the baseboards for scuff marks, checked under the rug for stains. She found only dust and the dried husks of long-dead insects. The kitchen was next. She pulled open every cabinet, rattled the drawers, checked behind the old microwave for any slip of paper or abandoned grocery list. She found nothing but a single cracked plate someone had left behind. She ran her fingers over the counters, trying to imagine Ethan's large hands chopping herbs, Carrie stirring a sauce with concentration. The refrigerator was unplugged now, door propped open to prevent mildew, shelves scrubbed clean. Emily squatted and peered into the vegetable crisper, where only the scent of bleach remained. She straightened slowly back, protesting, and closed the door gently. She felt anger start to coil in her chest, hot and ugly. She wanted to scream at the silence, to give her something, anything. She wanted the walls to tell her what had happened. She moved down the narrow hall to the bedroom Carrie and Ethan had shared that weekend. She hesitated at the threshold, breath-catching. The bed had been stripped mattress bare except for the plastic cover. Dust motes danced in the angled morning light. She walked to the window and drew back the thin curtain, letting more gray light flood in. The dunes outside rolled like ancient waves frozen in place. She turned back to the closet and pulled open the door. A single wire hanger swung gently as if in greeting. She got on her knees, feeling the ache in them as she examined the floor. That was when she noticed the air vent near the baseboard cover slightly askew. Her fingers trembled as she tugged it free. Inside was a small fabric-bound book worn at the edges, the cover a pale sea green. Emily sat back on her heels, the journal heavy in her hands. She wiped dust from the cover with her sleeve and opened it slowly. Carrie's handwriting bloomed across the pages in neat loops, some lines smudged with what might have been tears or damp salt air. Emily read entry after entry describing mundane details of the engagement plans, recipes tried for practice dinners, worries about guest lists. She felt tears sting her eyes as she read the words Carrie had written to herself, so full of hope and frustration and love. Then she found the last entry. It was dated the night they vanished. The words stopped her breath. Need to tell Ethan tonight. Doctor confirmed it. Emily closed the book hard enough to make the pages sigh. She pressed it to her chest, rocking slightly on the dusty floor. Her sister had been pregnant. She stood finally, legs shaky, and set the journal carefully on the stripped mattress. She felt the weight of it in her palms as if it held Carrie herself. She turned back to the hall and walked slowly as if moving through water. Her mind reeled with questions. Why had Carrie hidden it? Had she been afraid? She replayed the video on Ethan's phone in her head, Carrie whispering that they could not trust Brian. Emily felt nausea twist in her gut. She moved back to the living room and sat on the couch, the journal in her lap notebook beside her. She forced herself to write. She wrote about the entries about Carrie's plans to tell Ethan about the pregnancy no one had known. She wrote until her hand cramped and the ink smeared. She refused to stop. She would not forget a single word. The knock at the door made her flinch so hard she nearly dropped the journal. She froze, heart pounding in her ears. Another knock came harder this time. Emily stood slowly, placing the journal on the coffee table. She walked to the door and opened it a crack, squinting into the glare off the sand. Brian stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, hair, wind-tossed expression unreadable. He held up a hand in greeting, but his eyes flicked past her into the house. He asked if she was all right, Said he had heard she was in town and thought he should stop by. Emily's throat went dry. She pushed the door open a bit wider enough to see his face clearly, the small lines around his eyes deepening as he tried to smile. She felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had not seen him in years, but nothing about him looked the same to her anymore. He asked if he could come in. Emily hesitated, fingers tightening on the door. She told him she was busy, that she needed time alone. His expression flickered irritation surfacing before he smoothed it away. He insisted he just wanted to check on her, make sure she was okay. Emily's heart thudded painfully. She felt the house press in around her, silent witness to the conversation. She told him again she needed to be alone. He held her gaze for a long moment before finally nodding, stepping back from the porch. He told her he would be around if she wanted to talk, that he understood this was hard. She watched him walk back to his truck, his posture stiff. When he drove away, dust curling behind the tires, she let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. Emily closed the door slowly and locked it, turning the deadbolt with shaking fingers. She leaned back against the wood, eyes closing as she tried to calm her racing heart. The journal sat on the table, innocent and damning all at once. She walked back to it, picked it up, and held it tight. She forced herself to keep breathing in and out until the tremor in her hands subsided. She sat on the couch again, letting the silence settle like dust on her shoulders. She opened the notebook and wrote everything she could remember about Brian, every interaction that now felt loaded with new meaning. She would not let herself forget how he had looked past her into the house, eyes searching, how his voice had gone tight when she refused him. Emily drove slowly into town that afternoon, the journal resting in the passenger seat like a living thing. She kept glancing at it as if it might speak up and answer the questions burning in her mind. The roads through Corolla were quiet in the shoulder season. Most of the summer rentals empty now, shops displaying half-hearted autumn decor in their windows. She parked near the small local diner, the one with a cracked neon sign and the promise of hot coffee no matter the hour. She pushed through the door and let the warm, greasy air wash over her, the clatter of dishes and low murmur of conversation filling her ears like music she did not remember missing. She took a booth near the back and set the journal gently beside her, ordering coffee when the waitress stopped by. She felt like she had stepped into another lifetime, one where Carrie and Ethan were still alive and planning their wedding. She opened the journal again while she waited, flipping through pages covered in Carrie's neat script. She ran her finger over the words describing Ethan's stubbornness about something he refused to discuss, her growing anxiety over the coming dinner. Emily bit her lip until it hurt, tasting the salt of tears she refused to shed in public. When the coffee arrived, she closed the book carefully and wrapped her hands around the mug for warmth. She remembered that last call with Carrie, how distracted she had sounded, brushing off Emily's concern with a brittle laugh. It was easy to forget how good Carrie had been at pretending everything was fine. She thought about Ethan, loyal to a fault, the kind of man who would give anyone a second chance. She wondered if that had been what killed them in the end. After finishing her coffee, she tucked the journal into her bag and left cash on the table. She walked out into the crisp afternoon and stood on the sidewalk, breathing deeply. She turned toward the marina, drawn there by instinct more than plan. The wooden piers creaked underfoot as she wandered past small boats bobbing and their slips lines rattling in the wind. She paused near the end of the dock and watched the water slap against the pilings. The cold air off the sound made her eyes water. She turned slowly when she heard footsteps behind her and saw Linda, the bartender from the only real tavern in town, standing with a cigarette dangling from her fingers. Emily recognized her immediately, remembering late nights when she and Carrie had sat at her bar sharing greasy fries and cheap drinks. Linda nodded in greeting and flicked her cigarette into the water, stepping closer. She studied Emily's face for a long moment before saying she had heard she was back in town. Emily felt her throat tighten but managed to nod. Linda asked quietly if she was here about Carrie and Ethan. Emily swallowed hard and said she was trying to figure out what really happened. Linda looked away toward the water, her lined face thoughtful. She spoke slowly, choosing her words. She said she remembered the night they went missing because Brian had come into the bar wet from the rain, angry in a way she had not seen before. He had been drinking whiskey neat, muttering about Ethan ruining everything. Emily felt her pulse spike at that. She pressed for details, her voice husky. Linda shook her head slowly but added that Brian had stormed out without paying, slamming the door so hard the bell fell off. Emily felt a shiver travel through her as she thanked Linda quietly. The older woman gave her shoulder a squeeze before walking back up the dock toward her car. Emily stayed there a moment longer, watching the sunlight waver on the water, trying to fit this new piece into the puzzle that refused to take shape. She turned and made her way back to her own car, heart hammering with unease. She could not stop thinking about Brian drinking alone, ranting about Ethan. It made her wonder if Carrie had known how bad it had gotten between them. She tried to imagine Ethan losing his temper, shouting back. She could not, but she could see Brian doing it, jaw-tight, voice low and venomous. She felt sick at the idea that Carrie had been there, caught in the middle. She drove straight to the sheriff's office, next parking in the shade of a twisted old oak tree. The building was small clapboard like everything else in town, with a faded flag flapping out front. She sat in the car for a moment, gathering her thoughts before grabbing the journal and stepping out. Morales met her at the front desk, expression grim but welcoming. He led her into the small interview room with the same steady calm that had carried her through yesterday. She handed him the journal without a word, and watched as he turned to the pages carefully, eyes narrowing when he reached the last entries. He did not say anything at first, just set it down gently and folded his hands on the table. Emily forced herself to meet his gaze. He asked her softly if she had found anything else in the house. She shook her head slowly, feeling defeated. Morales thanked her for bringing it in and promised they would process it as evidence. He asked if she remembered anything else about Brian from that time. Emily hesitated and then told him about running into him at the house earlier, how he had demanded to come in, how his voice had gone sharp when she refused. Morales listened without interrupting, writing everything down. When she mentioned Linda's story about Brian drinking and cursing Ethan that night, Morales's eyes darkened. He tapped his pen against the table for a moment before saying quietly that they had never really followed up on Brian's movements that night. He admitted that the original investigation had been rushed. Emily felt the frustration boil in her chest at that. She bit her tongue to keep from screaming. Morales promised her they would talk to Linda officially. He said they needed to build a timeline that could challenge the old assumptions. Emily sat back in the hard plastic chair, her shoulders aching. She felt so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She asked Morales if he believed Brian could have done it. He did not answer directly, just said they would let the evidence speak. Emily wanted to argue, but found she did not have the energy. Instead, she watched him gather the journal carefully into an evidence bag, sealing it with practiced precision. She felt a deep sadness settle over her, as if she was watching the last traces of her sister vanish into a bureaucratic machine. She pressed her lips together until they hurt, refusing to cry in front of him. When she finally left the station, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. She drove back to the inn, slowly, headlights sweeping over the empty roads. She thought about Carrie on that last night, sitting at the table with Ethan, hoping to tell him about the baby, hoping to make peace. She wondered if Brian had walked in on that moment and seen everything he feared. She imagined his face twisted in anger, voice rising in the quiet house. She gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached. She wanted to know the truth, even if it killed her. She parked in front of the inn and sat in the darkening car, listening to the ocean roar beyond the dunes, feeling small and fragile in the growing night. Emily woke before dawn, the old inn creaking around her like a ship in a storm. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle the window frame, the smell of salt and mildew clinging to the blankets. She forced herself to sit up, swinging her legs over the side and pressing her feet to the cold floor. She rubbed her eyes hard, willing the heaviness to leave her chest. She had not really slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Carrie's face, the worry etched around her eyes the way she had sounded on the phone that last night. Emily pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt, tied her hair back tightly, and picked up her notebook from the nightstand. She felt brittle as she stood determined to do something, anything, to keep from sinking under the weight of memory. She walked outside into the cold gray light and let the wind slap her awake. The inn sat back from the beach, but she could hear the steady thrum of the ocean beyond the dunes. She stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the cold in her lungs. She turned and walked to her car keys, clenched tight in her fist bag slung over her shoulder. She drove the short distance into town, empty streets and darkened shops, reminding her how few people stayed through the off-season. She parked in front of the county records building, an old brick structure with peeling white trim. She sat in the car for a long moment, gathering courage. She needed answers, and she would find them here if they existed at all. She finally forced herself to get out, pulling the door shut with a finality that echoed in the empty street. Inside the building, the air smelled of old paper and damp carpet. A single clerk sat behind the desk reading a dog-eared paperback. Emily approached quietly, clearing her throat until he looked up with tired eyes. She explained what she was looking for in the steadiest voice she could manage, asking about business licenses and loan filings for Ethan and Brian's construction company. The clerk eyed her with mild suspicion but did not refuse. Instead, he led her to the back room, filled with filing cabinets and old computer terminals. He left her there with instructions on how to use the index. Emily set her bag on the table and began to search, fingers trembling as they traced the faded labels. She forced herself to focus, methodical and patient, just like the hospital training that never left her. She found the first folder under Campbell and Holt Construction, LLC, the papers crisp and official with the state seal. It looked ordinary at first, a standard partnership agreement from years ago. She flipped through page after page until she found what she was looking for. An unsigned proposal dated just weeks before they disappeared. It was stamped draft in red letters at the top. Her breath caught as she read the details. Expansion to Miami, a huge commercial development contract. Required loan amount $2 million. She swallowed, hard eyes scanning the clauses. It specified that Ethan would have to co-sign personally, putting their house and all assets on the line. She let out a shaky breath and turned the page. There were handwritten notes in the margin, angry scribbles that made her heart clench. Ethan's distinctive blocky print said no and too much risk. She sat back in the chair, feeling her heart thunder in her chest. She ran her hand over her face and took another deep breath. She closed the folder gently and took out her notebook, copying every detail. She refused to leave anything behind. When she finished, she returned the folder carefully, fingers shaking. She left the building into the pale morning light, squinting at the brightness. She walked slowly to her car, bag bumping against her hip, and sat in the driver's seat staring at nothing for a long moment. She felt a cold certainty settling in her bones. Brian had needed Ethan to sign. Ethan had refused. The argument was there in black and white, written across the margins like a death sentence. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the bile rising in her throat. She drove to the beach house next the old Corolla rental, standing silent and waiting. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell greeting her like an old wound. She sat on the dusty couch and spread her notes across the coffee table. She placed Carrie's journal beside them, fingers lingering on the cover. She read Ethan's angry notes again, imagining his face as he told Brian no. She could hear Carrie's voice in her head, saying they could not trust him anymore. Emily felt tears fill her eyes but blinked them away stubbornly. She would not cry. Not now. She would finish this. She leaned back and stared at the cracked ceiling. She thought about the business Brian had built since then, the ads she had seen in town, the new trucks with shiny logos. She wondered if everyone knew what it had cost. After an hour, she gathered everything up carefully and locked the house behind her. She drove to the sheriff's office, heart pounding with every mile. Morales was waiting, looking tired but alert, a paper cup of coffee steaming on his desk. She dropped her notes and copies onto the table between them. She told him about the draft agreement, the cosign demand, the expansion plan. She watched his face tighten as he read the notes. She added everything Linda had said about Brian ranting in the bar, the way he had tried to force his way into the house yesterday. Morales tapped the pen against the desk and thought-brow furrowed. He thanked her quietly, but did not make promises. He said they would need to verify it all. Emily felt a wave of exhaustion at that. She knew he was right, but she wanted to scream. She wanted him to arrest Brian right now. Instead, she sat back and watched him seal the documents into an evidence bag. He told her they would get the bank records if they could subpoena the loan applications check for Brian's signature on anything. He asked her to stay in town longer in case they needed her. She agreed, voice low and hoarse. She felt empty as she stood gathering her bag. She paused at the door and looked back. Morales sat with his elbows on the table, head bowed over the files. He looked like a man trying to hold the weight of someone else's tragedy without letting it crush him. She turned and left, quietly pulling the door shut behind her with a final click that seemed to echo through the hallway. Emily walked back to her car in the late afternoon sun. The air had turned cooler, the wind sharper off the ocean. She rested her hand on the roof of the car and closed her eyes, letting the chill wake her up. She opened the door and sat back beside her fingers, tracing the cracked leather of the steering wheel. She felt the fatigue settle into her bones, the kind of tired that no amount of sleep could fix. She thought about Carrie's hopeful journal entries, the way she had planned to tell Ethan the big news. She wondered if they had argued about the baby, too. She hated that question. She hated herself for asking it. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counting to 10 over and over until the tears finally stopped threatening. Emily left the sheriff's office with the weight of the new evidence pressing heavily on her shoulders. She walked slowly to her car, watching the wind ripple across the empty lot, feeling the cold bite of salt air on her face. She let herself sit behind the wheel without starting the engine, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes looked hollow and red-rimmed. She had spent so long trying to keep herself together, trying to act like a witness and not a grieving sister, that she could not remember how to feel anything but numb. She pressed her forehead to the steering wheel and closed her eyes. She needed to talk to someone who had known Ethan and Carrie as she had. She needed to hear their voices again, even if it was only through memory. She found herself driving to Brian's house without really planning it, the car moving almost on its own. The subdivision was newer built for vacation rentals, and retirees' rows of identical houses painted cheerful colors that seemed mocking in the overcast light. She parked on the street and sat for a moment before forcing herself out. She walked up the driveway, heart thudding in her chest, and knocked firmly on the door. There was a long pause before Maggie opened it, and her face pale and drawn hair pulled back in a loose knot. She blinked in surprise at seeing Emily, but stepped aside without a word, letting her in. The living room smelled faintly of lavender cleaner, and children's toys were stacked neatly in a basket near the TV. Maggie gestured for Emily to sit, and they both sank onto opposite ends of the couch, silence stretching between them. Emily cleared her throat and tried to keep her voice steady. She told Maggie about the journal, about the pregnancy Carrie had never shared with anyone, about the fight over the loan, about Linda's memory of Brian at the bar. Maggie listened with her eyes wide and shining fingers twisting in her lap. She said nothing at first, and Emily wondered if she would even respond. Finally, Maggie let out a shaking breath and leaned forward, elbows on her knees, voice cracking. She told Emily that Brian had come home that night just before dawn, soaked to the skin sand in his hair and clothes. He had not spoken a word. She remembered the way he had refused to look at her, how he had stripped off the wet clothes in the laundry room and left them in a heap. She had found them later stiff with dried salt and caked sand. Emily felt her heart race at that, her mouth dry. She pressed Maggie gently for more. Maggie wiped her eyes and said she had asked him if he had been at the beach house. He had snapped at her to mind her own business, something he had never done before. She had not known what to do, so she had pretended nothing was wrong. She said he barely slept that day, pacing the house like a caged animal. Emily swallowed hard and asked about the weeks after, if he had talked about Ethan and Carrie at all. Maggie nodded slowly, voice barely above a whisper, saying he had cried sometimes when he thought she could not hear him, but other times he had raged, punching the walls, shouting about how Ethan had ruined everything, how no one understood what it was like to carry the whole company alone. Emily felt bile rise in her throat, but forced herself to keep her voice calm. She asked Maggie if she still had any of those clothes from that night. Maggie hesitated, looking horrified, and shook her head slowly. She said Brian had gathered them up and taken them away to be washed at the laundromat the next day, refusing to let her touch them. Emily sat back, the silence between them growing heavy. She realized Maggie's eyes were filled with something that looked like relief as she spoke, as if she had been waiting years for someone to ask these questions. Emily reached out and squeezed her hand gently, feeling the tremor there. She wanted to hate Maggie for staying silent, but she could not. She could see how fear and love could twist around each other until it was impossible to separate them. Maggie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a deep breath. She said she had something else, something she had never told anyone. She stood and went to a small secretary desk in the corner, opening a drawer and pulling out a small black box. She handed it to Emily with shaking fingers. Inside was a diamond engagement ring with a simple, elegant band. Emily felt the breath leave her lungs in one painful rush. It was Ethan's ring for Carrie, the one he had shown her a picture of, the one he had picked out himself. Maggie said she had found it in the glove box of Brian's truck a week after the disappearance. She had confronted him, and he had shouted that it must have fallen out of Ethan's bag or jacket that night. She had believed him then because she had wanted to believe him. Emily closed the box slowly, hands trembling. Emily sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the ring heavy in her palm. She thought about the plans Ethan had made, the way he had wanted to surprise Carrie with the proposal all over again at the end of their engagement weekend. She imagined him standing there smiling nervously. Carrie's laughter spilling into the wind. The image twisted and shattered into something dark and cold. She felt tears slip down her cheeks unchecked. Maggie watched her with wide eyes and then covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing quietly. Emily set the ring carefully on the table between them and reached out, wrapping her arms around Maggie in a fierce, desperate hug. They sat like that for what felt like forever. Two women, bound together by grief and betrayal, neither had truly understood until now. Eventually, they pulled apart, wiping at their eyes and trying to compose themselves. Emily gathered the ring back into its box and slipped it carefully into her bag. She promised Maggie she would give it to Morales, that it needed to be part of the evidence. Maggie only nodded, voice gone hoarse from crying. She asked if she would be in trouble for keeping it. Emily shook her head firmly, telling her the truth mattered now more than ever. She stood slowly, legs stiff and heavy, and squeezed Maggie's hand one last time before turning toward the door. The late afternoon light slanted through the blinds, painting the room in long bands of gold and shadow. Emily paused at the threshold, looking back at Maggie, curled on the couch, face buried in her hands. She wanted to say something comforting, but found no words would come. Emily walked out into the cold wind, the door clicking shut behind her. She stood on the porch for a moment, eyes closed, breathing deeply. She felt the salt sting her lips and let it remind her she was alive. She was here for a reason. She walked back to her car and sat heavily in the driver's seat. She set the bag on the passenger seat and rested her head against the steering wheel. She felt exhausted in a way sleep would never fix. She thought about Ethan's handwriting scrawled in the margins of that contract, the single word "no" standing out like a final verdict. She thought about Carrie's journal, the baby she had wanted so badly, the family she had tried to build out of love. She thought about Brian pacing his house sand in his hair rage in his heart, destroying everything he claimed to care about. Emily drove back to the sheriff's office as dusk settled over the town, the roads growing darker and lonelier with every mile. The engagement ring sat in its small black box on the seat beside her, silent and accusing. She kept glancing at it, feeling her stomach twist every time she remembered Maggie's shaking hands as she handed it over. The headlights cut through the swirling sea mist, throwing pale beams onto the cracked asphalt. She felt a grim determination settle in her chest. She would not let this rest. She would not allow Carrie and Ethan to stay lost in the shadows of other people's lies. She gripped the wheel tightly, forcing her mind to stay sharp, despite the exhaustion dragging at her eyelids and the ache that had settled into the base of her skull. She stepped into the station, the air inside stale and warm after the cold outside. Morales looked up from his desk, his eyes immediately going to her face. He did not speak at first, waiting for her to cross the room and set the small box between them. She explained in a low voice everything Maggie had told her, every word of the confession she had pried loose from behind years of fear. Morales listened without interrupting, writing careful notes in his weathered notebook, his brow furrowed with concentration. When she finished, he reached out and took the ring box, opening it carefully and staring at the glint of diamond that had once been meant for a promise. He closed it slowly and set it aside, rubbing his eyes. He told her she had done good, that this was real evidence that would make a difference. Emily sat in the cracked plastic chair across from him, her bag in her lap, her fingers worrying at the strap. She told him she felt like she could barely keep breathing. He nodded slowly, eyes tired but focused. He said they had been talking to the Marine Patrol, asking for help with a targeted dive. He explained that with the new evidence, they had probable cause to search offshore near the marina, where Brian's truck had been seen parked late that night. Emily felt her heart hammer in her chest at that. She asked if they really thought they would find anything after all this time. Morales paused before answering, saying it was a long shot, but not impossible. The currents were strong, but weighted objects could catch on wreckage or reefs. He said they had to try for Carrie and Ethan, if no one else. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the wind cutting in off the water with a sharp edge. Emily stood at the edge of the marina, watching the dive team gear up their bright suits and heavy tanks, looking almost alien against the simple wooden docks. Morales stood beside her, collar turned up against the wind, coffee steaming in a paper cup. He told her she did not have to be there for this, that she could wait back at the station. She shook her head firmly, refusing to leave. She watched as the divers checked their lines, nodded to each other, and slipped into the churning gray water with practiced efficiency. The surface quickly went still except for the faint ripples where they had gone under, leaving Emily feeling strangely hollow. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep the wind from stealing what little warmth she had left. The hours stretched painfully as they waited. Boats drifted in and out of the harbor. Seagulls cried overhead. The wind pushed small whitecaps against the pilings. Emily paced the dock, slowly, eyes scanning the water as if she might see something break the surface. Morales stayed close, saying little occasionally, checking the radio clipped to his belt. Every time it crackled to life, she froze, breath-catching, but it was always mundane chatter updates on position or requests for more line. She began to feel foolish for hoping they would find anything after all these years. The ocean was too big, too merciless, too eager to erase what people wanted to remember. She tried to tell herself it was enough that they were trying, but it did not feel like enough. She wanted to scream at the water, to demand it give back what it had stolen. Finally, late in the afternoon, the radio crackled with urgent chatter. Morales straightened instantly, pressing the button and barking a short reply. Emily felt her heart leap into her throat. They heard the diver's strained voice, distorted by static, saying they had found something snagged on the wreckage at the bottom, something wrapped in heavy plastic weighted down with old diving weights. Emily covered her mouth with her hands, feeling tears sting her eyes. She watched as the crew scrambled to prepare retrieval equipment, voices rising with nervous energy. Morales squeezed her shoulder gently before moving to help coordinate. She stayed rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the spot where the water bubbled and churned, knowing in her bones that this was it. This was the moment they had been crawling toward since she first set foot back in town. It took hours to bring it up, the sun setting and casting the entire harbor in bruised purple and gold. The divers surfaced again and again, giving clipped updates, the winch groaning under the weight of waterlogged material. When the object finally broke the surface, Emily felt her knees buckle and had to grip the railing to stay upright. It was a heavy, industrial tarp, dark green and slick with algae, wrapped tight around something unyielding and human-shaped. She heard one of the younger deputies gag behind her, the smell of salt and decay hitting the cold air like a slap. She turned away for a moment, pressing her face into her sleeve, shaking all over. Morales barked orders calmly, voice firm and low, keeping everyone moving. No one allowed to panic or look away for too long. This was evidence he kept saying this was truth, no matter how ugly. Emily watched as they laid the bundle onto the dock, the divers and deputies stepping back with grim faces. She forced herself to step forward even when Morales tried to hold her back. She needed to see it. She needed to know. The tarp had partially split in the retrieval, revealing bleached bone and the remnants of clothes she recognized instantly. Ethan's favorite work shirt, a pale blue flannel he had worn so often it was soft as cotton. She let out a strangled sound that hurt her throat and doubled over, hands on her knees, tears streaming unchecked. Morales finally led her away, one arm firm around her shoulders, guiding her back to the edge of the dock where she could breathe. He spoke in a low voice, telling her she did not have to look anymore, that she had done enough. But she could not stop looking, even as the deputies worked with careful precision under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. When they finished loading the evidence into the waiting van, Emily felt like she was standing in the aftermath of a storm. Everything felt hushed and expectant, the world holding its breath. She watched the van doors close with a dull, final thump, the weight of 5 years collapsing into that single moment. Morales stood beside her, his face lined and weary, the wind ruffling his thinning hair. He told her softly that this changed everything. They would have the remains examined, they would match the clothing, they would find the weights that had kept them hidden. He said it was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide. Emily nodded numbly, unable to speak, every muscle in her body vibrating with exhaustion and adrenaline. She closed her eyes and felt the wind on her face, salty and cold, and let it carry away the last of her strength. Emily sat in the small, gray-walled waiting room of the sheriff's station the next morning, the cheap chair biting into her back as she rocked slightly, trying to soothe herself. The smell of burned coffee lingered in the air. She felt raw and empty after the recovery at the marina. She had not slept more than an hour. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's shirt tangled in that tarp, the pale bone of his arm visible under the floodlights. She dug her nails into her palms until the sting reminded her she was still here, still breathing. Across the hall, she could hear low voices, the shuffle of papers, the squeak of boots on the tile. Morales had told her she did not need to be there for the next part, but she had refused to leave. She needed to see this through. She needed to know what Brian would say. Inside the interview room, Morales sat across from Brian, who looked rumpled and unshaven. His eyes red-rimmed but dry. His posture was rigid, hands clasped in front of him on the table. He did not seem to know what to do with himself. Morales spoke slowly, his voice calm but heavy, laying out everything they had found. The dive recovery, the identification of Ethan's shirt, the weights, the blood traces found on Brian's boat. Brian's face twitched at that, but he said nothing. Morales waited him out, fingers drumming quietly on the table. He told Brian they had enough to charge him, that the truth would come out whether he spoke or not. Brian let out a long breath and sagged in his chair, eyes falling to the tabletop. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, the words tumbling out in uneven gasps. He said he never meant for any of it to happen that way. He said Ethan was his best friend, his brother. They had built the company together from nothing. He said they had been fighting for weeks about the expansion, the loan, the future. He said he was so angry that night, felt betrayed when Ethan refused to sign, told him he was reckless and greedy. Morales stayed quiet, letting him ramble. Brian's voice cracked as he described driving to the beach house in the storm, parking by the dunes and seeing the lights still on. He said he had just wanted to talk to make Ethan see reason to save the company. He wiped at his face with shaking hands. He said Carrie opened the door looking scared. He said Ethan was shouting already before he even stepped inside. Morales leaned forward slightly, asking him to keep going. Brian swallowed, hard eyes, unfocused voice dropping even lower. He said they argued in the living room, voices rising over the wind, rattling the windows. He said Ethan pushed him first, that it was supposed to be just another stupid fight like they always had. But this time, Brian shoved back harder than he meant to. He said Ethan fell against the coffee table, hit his head, stopped moving. He described the silence that followed the wind howling outside like it was mocking him. Morales watched him closely, expression unreadable. Brian shook his head. Voice rising in panic, saying Carrie screamed when she saw Ethan on the floor, said she tried to call for help. He said he snapped. He said he grabbed her and they struggled. He admitted hitting her, said she went limp in his arms. Emily listened through the thin wall, every word slamming into her chest like a fist. She felt like she might vomit. She pressed her hands to her mouth, breathing hard through her nose. Morales asked Brian what he did next. Brian's voice was thin and strangled as he described dragging their bodies outside into the pouring rain, loading them into his truck under cover of darkness. He said he drove them to the marina because he did not know what else to do. He described wrapping them in tarps, weighting them with diving gear, pushing them off the side of his boat into the black water. He said he sat there afterward for hours, shaking and crying, watching the storm swallow everything. He said he cleaned the house until sunrise, scrubbing every surface with bleach, making it look like they had just left in a hurry. Morales kept his voice steady, asking about the ring. Brian flinched at that, eyes darting to the side. He admitted he found it in Ethan's pocket when he was wrapping him up. He said he could not bring himself to throw it away. He said he put it in his glove box and forgot about it until Maggie found it. He broke off, then covering his face with his hands. Emily heard the muffled sound of him sobbing through the wall. She felt tears on her own cheeks, hot and relentless. She tried to hate him. She tried to summon the rage she knew she should feel, but all she felt was hollow. Morales did not offer him comfort. He sat back, let the silence stretch, let Brian's crying burn itself out. Then he told Brian quietly that it was over, that they would write it all up, that he would spend the rest of his life paying for what he had done. Later, Morales came out into the hall, his face pale and lined. He sat down next to Emily and handed her a bottle of water. She took it without speaking, staring at the floor. Morales told her Brian had given a full confession, that they had it on tape, that he had signed a written statement. He said the DA would push for murder charges, that there was no way Brian was getting out of this. Emily nodded slowly, feeling her throat burn. She asked if it would go to trial. Morales shrugged tiredly, said it depended on if Brian took a deal to avoid the death penalty. Emily closed her eyes, trying to imagine standing in a courtroom listening to Brian's voice say those words again in front of strangers. She did not know if she could survive it. She let out a long, shuddering breath and forced herself to sit up straighter. Morales told her they had already contacted the medical examiner. He said they would work to identify the second body, that it was almost certainly Carrie, given the location and the circumstances. He asked if Emily was ready for that. She shook her head numbly, but said she would be. He placed a hand on her shoulder gently, the weight of it steady and grounding. He said she had done more than enough, that she had brought the truth into the light. Emily felt something inside her shift at that, a painful mix of relief and devastation. She wiped at her eyes, roughly hating how raw she felt. Morales stood slowly, stretching his stiff back, and told her he needed to call the DA's office. He said she could stay as long as she needed. Emily nodded without looking up, gripping the bottle of water until the plastic crumpled in her palm. She sat alone in the quiet of the hall for a long time after he left, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white. She thought about Carrie's journal, in evidence the pages filled with hope and fear and love. She thought about Ethan's notes scrawled angrily on that loan draft, the word no standing out like a verdict. She thought about Brian's voice cracking as he described killing them, the panic and sorrow that came too late. She felt cold all over, shaking, despite the warmth of the room. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them, pressing her face into her legs. She did not want to be strong anymore. She did not want to hold it together for anyone else. She just wanted them back. Emily left the sheriff's office that evening with the confession still echoing in her ears, each word replaying in harsh detail. The wind had picked up again, pushing salt-heavy air against her face as she walked to her car. She fumbled with the keys, hands shaking the world around her, blurring through tears that refused to stay back. She sank into the driver's seat and rested her head on the steering wheel. She felt every bit of her body vibrating with exhaustion, with anger, with a grief so deep it felt endless. She remembered Brian's voice cracking as he described the moment Ethan stopped moving the hollow way he talked about wrapping Carrie's body. She squeezed her eyes shut until stars danced behind them, forcing herself to stay silent when all she wanted to do was scream. She drove aimlessly for a while, headlights illuminating empty roads lined with darkened beach rentals and twisted dunes. She finally found herself pulling up outside the old beach house, the place that felt like the center of everything that had gone wrong. She sat there for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled, listening to the ocean roaring in the distance. She remembered Carrie telling her on the phone how excited she was to spend that weekend with Ethan. She remembered Ethan's easy grin, the way he would always ruffle her hair, even though she pretended to hate it. She felt her chest tighten painfully. She could not stop seeing them on that last night, caught in a storm they had not seen coming, trusting someone who had betrayed them in the worst way. She forced herself out of the car and walked up the creaking steps of the porch, fumbling with the key. The door swung open slowly, whining on its old hinges. The living room looked exactly as it had when she first returned days earlier. The couch sagged. The coffee table was empty except for the thin layer of dust. She walked slowly inside, footsteps muffled on the worn rug, the silence pressing in around her. She stood in the center of the room, trying to picture them here. Ethan's voice raised, but calm. Carrie's worried expression as she tried to keep the peace. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold all over. She turned in a slow circle, taking in every detail. The walls felt like they were holding secrets, the kind no amount of cleaning could scrub away. She walked to the window and looked out at the dunes. The grass was flattened by wind, pale in the moonlight. She could see the line of the surf crashing endlessly against the sand. She thought about the confession about Brian dragging their bodies out in the storm, loading them into his truck like so much cargo. She'd remembered Morales saying they had cleaned up so well it took years to find even the smallest crack in the story. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, breathing slowly, feeling the ache in her ribs with every inhale. She whispered apologies she knew no one would hear to Carrie for not being there, to Ethan for not protecting them, to herself for not seeing what was right in front of her. She turned away and wandered back down the hall. She paused at the bedroom door, hand on the frame. She pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The air felt stale, heavy with memory. She looked at the bed stripped of blankets, the closet door ajar. She crossed to it and opened it wider, staring into the empty space. She remembered finding Carrie's journal tucked into the vent. She stepped inside the closet, small and dark, and sat on the floor. She rested her head against the wall, pulling her knees up. She felt the old wood cool against her skin. She closed her eyes and let the memories come. Carrie's laugh, Ethan's teasing voice, the way they looked at each other like the whole world disappeared when they were together. She let herself cry, then quiet and shuddering, no one to see or hear. Hours passed like that, the house growing colder around her. She finally forced herself to stand, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. She left the bedroom and closed the door softly behind her. She walked back to the living room and picked up her notebook from the coffee table. She sat on the couch, spine straight, and began to write. She wrote everything she remembered about them, the things she had loved most, the fights they had shared, the plans they had made. She wrote down the confession in her own words so she would never forget it. She wrote about the ring Maggie had kept hidden, the last secret no one wanted to admit. She wrote until her hand cramped the pages, filling with her cramped, messy script. When she finally stopped, she let the pen fall onto the floor and sat back. She felt hollowed out, but the words on the page felt like something solid she could hold. She closed the notebook carefully and set it on the table. She stood slowly, legs aching, and walked to the front door. She paused with her hand on the knob, turning to look at the room one last time. She felt like she was saying goodbye not just to them, but to the version of herself who had believed they would always be safe. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The wind slapped her face sharp and cold. She closed the door behind her firmly and locked it, the click of the deadbolt loud in the quiet night. She walked down the steps to the sand shoes, sinking into the cool grains. She headed toward the dunes without looking back. The moon hung low and heavy, casting long shadows that wavered in the wind. She stopped at the edge of the water and let the waves rush over her feet, icy enough to make her shiver. She watched the ocean for a long time, listening to it roar and hush, the eternal sound of something that swallowed secrets and never gave them back. She whispered their names into the wind, hoping it would carry them somewhere better. She told them she was sorry, that she was trying, that she would not stop. She let the tears fall freely, mixing with the salt spray on her face. When she finally turned back toward the house, she felt like something had shifted inside her. Not healed, not even close, but changed. She knew she would go back to the sheriff's office tomorrow. She knew she would give Morales the notebook, let him add it to the evidence. She knew she would talk to the DA even if the thought made her stomach turn. She knew she would sit with Maggie if she asked, hold her hand while they waited for the news about charges and trials. She would do it because someone had to, because Carrie and Ethan deserved that much. She would keep going step by painful step until the truth was no longer something whispered in dark rooms, but something spoken out loud in the clear light of day. Emily returned to the sheriff's office the next morning under a sky heavy with low-gray clouds that seemed to press down on the town in suffocating silence. She parked in the gravel lot and sat in the car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. She watched people come and go in the soft drizzle that fell without sound on the windshield. She thought about everything she had written the night before, the pages now sitting in the passenger seat in her battered notebook. She picked it up slowly, feeling its weight as if it held her entire life in those cramped lines of ink. She finally took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping out into the cold, damp air with grim determination. She would not let herself turn away now, no matter how much her body screamed to run. Inside the station, the air smelled of burnt coffee and tired paper. She walked down the narrow hallway lined with faded community notices and flyers for lost dogs until she reached Morales' office. The door was open, and he looked up when he heard her steps, his face drawn with fatigue but alert. She stood in the doorway for a moment, dripping rain onto the floor before she held out the notebook to him with steady hands. He took it carefully, glancing at the worn cover before meeting her eyes. She told him quietly that it was everything she knew, everything she remembered, everything she refused to forget. He nodded once and gestured for her to sit. She lowered herself into the hard chair, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease fractionally. Morales opened the notebook and began reading slowly, his finger tracking the words as if they were precious evidence that might slip away if he did not hold them down. Emily watched him carefully, reading his expression for any shift, any sign that this was not enough. But he stayed focused, nodding occasionally as he turned page after page. When he finally closed it, he set it gently on his cluttered desk and let out a long breath. He said they would add it to the case file, that it mattered, that it would help ensure Brian would never see freedom again. Emily nodded, too exhausted to even feel relief. She sat there staring at the dingy floor, feeling the chill from her wet clothes sink deep into her bones. After a long silence, Morales spoke again, his voice softer than she expected. He told her the medical examiner had confirmed the second set of remains. It was Carrie. They had matched dental records and the small fragment of the silver locket that had stayed lodged in the folds of the tarp. Emily felt the words hit her like a blow. She closed her eyes, pressing her lips together until they hurt. She had known, of course, she had always known, but hearing it confirmed made her vision swim with tears she refused to let fall. Morales did not say anything else for a moment, just let the silence stretch heavy and respectful. He finally added that the DA was moving forward with double homicide charges and kidnapping for what Brian had done to her sister and Ethan. Emily managed to whisper that it was right, that it was what they deserved. She left the station later with the weight of finality pressing against her ribs. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle mist, turning the world to watercolor grays and greens. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and walked slowly to her car. She sat inside for a moment, listening to the patter on the roof and feeling the ache in her chest. She thought about Carrie's face lit by laughter, about Ethan's warm hand on her shoulder, the way he had always treated her like family. She thought about the baby Carrie had carried, the new life that had never gotten to take a breath. She whispered their names like a prayer, hoping the wind would carry them somewhere safe. She turned the key in the ignition and let the engine rumble to life before pulling onto the empty street. She drove without thinking, letting the road lead her until she found herself at the cemetery on the edge of town. The gates were open, and she eased through them slowly, tires crunching on gravel slick with rain. She parked near the modest Walton family plot and stepped out onto the wet grass, feeling it soak her shoes. She walked carefully to the simple headstone marked with her parents' names, and now Carrie's name newly carved beneath them. She knelt in the mud without caring how dirty she got, pressing her palm against the cold granite. She closed her eyes and spoke quietly, telling Carrie that she was sorry for not protecting her, for not seeing what was coming, for letting her die, scared and alone. She promised she would not forget her, that she would make sure no one else did either. When she stood again, she wiped the mud from her knees with trembling hands and turned to leave. She paused, glancing at the space beside Carrie's name, knowing Ethan deserved a place there too. She made a mental note to speak with his family to make sure his memory would not be erased by the violence that had claimed him. She walked back to the car and sat inside, breathing deeply, trying to settle the tremor in her chest. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Maggie's number, hesitating for only a moment before pressing call. Maggie answered on the second ring, her voice cracked and hoarse. Emily told her softly about the medical examiner's confirmation about the charges, the trial that was coming. She listened as Maggie cried quietly on the other end. Emily promised her she would stand with her when they had to testify, that she would not let her face it alone. She said they owed it to Carrie and Ethan, and even to Maggie's own kids, to make sure Brian never hurt anyone else. Maggie sniffled and thanked, her voice shaking with gratitude and fear. Emily ended the call and set the phone carefully on the passenger seat. She rested her head back against the headrest, staring at the ceiling of the car, letting the tears come this time hot and unrelenting. She cried for Carrie, for Ethan, for the baby who never had a name, for the part of herself she had lost in this relentless search for truth. When the sobs finally subsided, she wiped her face roughly with her sleeve and took a steadying breath. She drove back to town slowly, watching the lights flicker on in windows as dusk settled over the narrow streets. She parked outside the beach house one more time, stepping onto the porch where the wind rattled the loose boards. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, standing in the center of the room, listening to the emptiness. She let her fingers trail over the faded furniture, the walls that had held so many secrets. She whispered that she would not let this place stay a shrine to violence and fear. She promised she would sell it, donate the money to a scholarship in Carrie and Ethan's names for young couples building something together for people trying to create instead of destroy. She knew it would not bring them back, but it felt like something real, something that mattered. She stood there for a long time, letting the memories come and go, letting herself feel all of it, the rage, the sorrow, the love that still refused to die. She finally closed the door gently behind her and locked it one last time. She walked back to her car, the wind tangling her hair, the cold biting at her cheeks. She started the engine and turned toward home, wherever that might be now. She drove slowly, watching the surf crash in the distance, the same ocean that had tried to keep its secrets buried forever. She told herself she would not stop fighting for the truth, even when it hurt, even when it broke her. She owed them that. She owed herself that. She drove on into the gathering dark, carrying the memory of her sister's laugh and Ethan's steady smile with her like a promise she refused to break. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more content like this. I would love to hear your thoughts on the plot and where you are watching from, so feel free to share in the comments below. Your feedback helps shape future stories and keeps this conversation alive.